Section 1. The air in the Atchafalaya Basin in late 1795 was a living thing, a suffocating blanket of moisture and decay that clung to the skin and filled the lungs. It was a place where the line between land and water blurred, where ancient cypress trees dripped with Spanish moss like the gray beards of forgotten gods. On a damp October morning, Constable Louis Mara of the Pointe Coupée parish stood at the edge of this primordial swamp, his boots sinking into the black, sucking mud. Before him, half submerged in the stagnant, tea-colored water, was a traveler's trunk. Its leather was swollen and peeling, its brass fittings corroded to a sickly green. It had been snagged on the gnarled roots of a cypress knee, a silent testament to a journey that had ended in horrifying abruptness. This was the third such discovery in as many months. 3 trunks, 3 different travelers, all vanished without a trace along the remote and treacherous trace road that cut through the wilderness. There were no bodies, there were never any bodies, just these sad waterlogged remnants like ghosts whispering of foul play from beneath the water's surface. Mara felt a familiar coldness seep into his bones, a dread that had nothing to do with the morning chill. The local Caddo and Choctaw tribes spoke of spirits that haunted these swamps, malevolent beings that lured the unwary to their doom. But Mara was a man of law and logic, and he did not believe in spirits. He believed in the darkness that resided not in the supernatural, but in the hearts of men. A darkness he felt was festering somewhere nearby, hidden behind a veneer of civility growing bolder with each soul it consumed. He had no evidence, only a string of disappearances and a deeply unsettling feeling that centered on a single, isolated establishment on that lonely road. A tavern known as L'Auberge du Corbeau of Fumé, the Inn of the Famished Crow. Section 2. The year 1795 was a time of violent transition for Louisiana. Though technically under Spanish rule, the territory remained a chaotic melting pot of French Creoles, Spanish officials, American frontiersmen, and displaced Native American tribes. It was a frontier in the truest sense of the word, a place of immense opportunity and even greater peril. Law was a distant concept, enforced by a handful of constables like Mara who were tasked with policing vast, untamable swaths of wilderness. Travelers were the lifeblood of the territory, merchants carrying goods from New Orleans, families seeking new land, and solitary speculators gambling on the future. They moved along crude, often unmarked roads, vulnerable to bandits, disease, and the unforgiving nature of the land itself. The official reports that reached Mara's desk were depressingly similar. A silk merchant from Biloxi vanished. A young couple from Natchez on their way to start a new life vanished. A surveyor mapping the Spanish land grants vanished. Each report was a ghost story in the making, a life abruptly erased. The Spanish authorities were concerned with politics and trade, not the fate of a few missing travelers on a forgotten road. They filed the reports away, attributing the disappearances to swamp fever, alligator attacks, or common banditry. But Mara saw a pattern that others chose to ignore. The victims were always traveling alone or in small groups. They were always carrying valuables, and their last known destination, the last point of rest before they were swallowed by the wilderness, was always the same. They were all expected to have stopped at the Inn of the Famished Crow. It was the only sanctuary for leagues in either direction, a lonely beacon of light in a sea of suffocating darkness. And Mara was beginning to suspect that the sanctuary was a trap, its light a lure for the lost and the weary. Section 3. L'Auberge du Corbeau of Fumé was not a place one stumbled upon by accident. It stood hunched by the side of the Trace Road, a squat 2-story building crafted from rough-hewn cypress logs, its roof sagging under the weight of perpetual dampness. A large iron-wrought sign creaked rhythmically in the humid breeze, depicting a stylized, unnervingly thin crow with its beak agape. The inn was owned and operated by a husband and wife, Jean-Baptiste and Delphine Arsenault. Jean-Baptiste was a mountain of a man, a former trapper with hands like cured hams and a face that seemed permanently set in a silent, brooding glower. He spoke little, his presence alone a form of quiet intimidation. His wife, Delphine, was his complete opposite. She was a handsome woman with a quick, welcoming smile and eyes that sparkled with an almost predatory intelligence. It was her charm that drew travelers in, her warm voice and promises of a hot meal and a dry bed that soothed their fears of the surrounding swamp. To most, they were a godsend, a bastion of civilization in a world that felt determined to devour them. The inn itself was dark and filled with the scent of wood smoke, roasting meat, and stale wine. The common room was dominated by a massive stone hearth that blazed year-round, casting flickering, distorted shadows upon the walls. It was a place that offered comfort, but a comfort that felt precarious. There was an unnerving stillness to the inn when it was empty, a silence that seemed to listen. And there were the crows, dozens of them. They roosted in the skeletal branches of the surrounding cypress trees, their black eyes fixed on the inn. They never made a sound, they just watched, waiting. It was this detail that Mara found most disturbing. Nature itself seemed to hold its breath around the Arsenaults' establishment. It was a place that felt fundamentally wrong, a macabre stage waiting for its next victim. Section 4. Constable Mara made his first official visit to the inn under the guise of a routine inquiry. He rode up on his tired mare, dismounting as the silent convocation of crows watched him from the trees. Delphine Arsenault greeted him at the door, wiping her hands on her apron, her smile as bright and practiced as ever. She invited him in, offering him a glass of wine and a seat by the fire. Jean-Baptiste was behind the bar, polishing a pewter mug with a slow, deliberate rhythm, his eyes never leaving Morrow. The constable began his questioning carefully, mentioning the recent disappearance of the surveyor, a man named Thomas Finch. He asked if they had seen him. Delphine's face adopted a look of practiced concern. "Oh, the poor man," she said, her voice dripping with sympathy. "Yes, he stayed with us 2 nights. A quiet gentleman. He was heading north towards the Opelousas post. Warned him about the dangers, of course. The swamp can be so treacherous." Jean-Baptiste simply grunted in agreement, his gaze unwavering. Morrow pressed, asking about Finch's demeanor, his equipment, anything that seemed out of the ordinary. The Arsenault's answers were flawless. They were consistent, detailed, and utterly believable. They painted a picture of 2 simple innkeepers, concerned for the welfare of their patrons but powerless against the whims of the wilderness. Morrow inspected the guest ledger. Finch's name was there, his signature clear and steady. So were the names of the young couple from Natchez and the silk merchant from Biloxi, all neatly recorded, all with departure dates noted. According to the book, every soul who had vanished had simply checked out and continued on their journey. The inn was a perfect dead end, a place where the trail of the lost grew cold. Morrow left with nothing but the taste of their wine on his tongue, an annoying suspicion that felt like a physical weight in his stomach. Their performance had been too perfect, their smiles too placid. It was the chilling calm of a predator that knows it cannot be seen. Section 5. Weeks turned into a month, and the dread in Point Coupé grew. Another traveler was reported missing, a priest, Father Michael O'Connell, who was making his rounds through the remote parishes. His horse, still saddled, was found wandering aimlessly on the trace road not 5 miles from the inn. Of the priest himself there was no sign. The case was becoming an obsession for Morrow. He spent his nights poring over maps, trying to find a connection, a flaw in the pattern. The victims were of different ages, different professions, from different places. Their only commonality was that they were outsiders, people with no local family to raise an immediate alarm. They were disposable, easy to erase. Morrow started speaking to the few locals who lived scattered in the backwoods, trappers, fishermen, and a small community of Acadians who kept to themselves. Most were wary of the constable, but they were even more wary of the inn. They didn't go there. They spoke of it in hushed tones, calling it La Maison du Diable, the devil's house. An old Choctaw woman told him a chilling story. She said that the land the inn was built on was cursed, a place where the earth had soured. She claimed that the smoke from the inn's chimney sometimes smelled wrong, a sweet, cloying odor that was not wood smoke or roasting pig. She said the crows that watched the inn were not ordinary birds, but the trapped souls of those who died there, forced to bear silent witness to an unending horror. It was folklore, superstition born of fear and isolation. But in the oppressive silence of the Louisiana night, these macabre stories felt more real than any official report. Morrow was a man of facts, but the facts were leading him nowhere. Perhaps, he thought, it was time to listen to the whispers. Perhaps the truth of this forbidden place was not something that could be found in a ledger, but in the disturbing nightmares of those who lived in its shadow. Section 6. Morrow knew that a direct confrontation without concrete evidence would be useless. The Arsenaults were cunning, and the local Spanish magistrate was lazy and unwilling to challenge a property-owning couple based on a constable's gut feeling and local superstitions. He needed something tangible, something that could not be explained away. He decided to focus on the land itself. The area around the inn was a labyrinth of cypress groves, stagnant ponds, and thick, thorny undergrowth. It was the perfect place to hide a body or 100 bodies. He began a series of clandestine surveys, riding out at dawn and dusk, avoiding the main road and circling the property from a distance. He told no one of his intentions. This was a private war now. For days he found nothing but the tracks of deer and wild boar. The swamp was an impenetrable fortress, jealously guarding its secrets. Then one evening, as the setting sun cast long, blood-red streaks across the sky, he found something. Tucked away in a dense thicket of palmettos nearly a mile behind the inn was a patch of disturbed earth. It was subtle, easily missed by an untrained eye, but Morrow had been a tracker before he was a constable. He could see the signs, the unnatural depression in the soil, the broken roots, the non-native weeds beginning to sprout. It was a shallow grave. With his heart pounding in his chest, he began to dig, using his bare hands and a large hunting knife. The soil was damp and heavy, and the air grew thick with the metallic scent of decay. A few feet down, his fingers brushed against something hard and smooth. He cleared the dirt away and stared down at the serene porcelain face of a doll, its painted blue eyes gazing up at him from the earth. Beside it lay a small silver locket, tarnished and caked with mud. He recognized it instantly from the missing persons report. It belonged to the young wife from Natchez. He had found his proof. Section 7. Discovery of the grave changed everything. It was the crack in the Arsenault's perfect facade, yet it presented a new, horrifying problem. A single grave proved a murder, but it did not prove the innkeepers were responsible. They could claim it was the work of bandits who had accosted their guests after they had left the inn. Morrow knew he needed more. He needed to connect the crime directly to the tavern itself. The memory of the old Choctaw woman's words returned to him, the smoke that smelled wrong. It was a strange, almost unbelievable clue, but it was all he had. He needed to get closer to observe the inn without being seen. He found a vantage point on a small rise deep within the cypress grove overlooking the back of the property. It was a miserable spot, infested with mosquitoes and snakes, but it provided a clear view of the inn's rear entrance, its smokehouse, and the large, constantly burning fire pit behind the kitchen where they disposed of trash. For 2 days and nights he watched, his body aching and his resolve hardening. He saw Jean-Baptiste haul barrels and crates, his movements efficient and powerful. He saw Delphine tending to a small, unnervingly neat garden of herbs. They were the very picture of industrious homesteaders. Then on the third night, under the sliver of a crescent moon, he saw it. Jean-Baptiste emerged from the back of the inn, dragging a large, heavy burlap sack. It was not a sack of flour or grain. It moved with a dead, uneven weight, and Moreau could have sworn he saw a dark, reddish liquid seeping from the bottom, staining the ground. Jean-Baptiste dragged it not to the trash pit, but to the smokehouse. He unlocked the heavy wooden door, tossed the sack inside, and locked it again. An hour later, thick, greasy smoke began to curl from the smokehouse chimney, and the wind, shifting, carried the scent towards Moreau. It was, as the old woman had said, a sweet, cloying, deeply disturbing odor. It was the smell of roasted meat, but it was a scent his mind recoiled from, a primal, horrifying recognition of something that should not be. It was the smell of cooked man. Section 8. The horrifying realization washed over Moreau in a wave of nausea and cold fury. The scale of the depravity he was facing was beyond anything he could have imagined. This was not simple murder for profit. This was something else entirely, something methodical, practiced, and utterly monstrous. The smokehouse was not for curing pork or smoking venison. It was a charnel house, a place where the evidence of their crimes was systematically destroyed. Or was it? The thought that followed was even more disturbing. What if destruction wasn't the only purpose? The inn was famous for Delphine's savory meat pies and the rich, dark stew she always had simmering over the hearth. Travelers raved about it. They called it the most satisfying meal they'd ever had. Moreau felt his stomach heave. The tavern that served more than wine, the famished crow. It was all there, hidden in plain sight, a joke of such macabre proportions that no sane mind would ever consider it. The victims weren't just robbed and murdered. They were being processed. They were being served. This forbidden truth was the foundation upon which the inn was built. The knowledge was a poison. Moreau stumbled back from his hiding place, his mind reeling. He had to act, but he was alone. The Pointe Coupée magistrate would never believe such a story without overwhelming proof. A shallow grave with a doll and a locket was one thing. Accusing respected business owners of industrial-scale cannibalism based on a strange smell was another. He would be dismissed as a madman. He needed to get inside the inn, specifically into that smokehouse and the cellar he was sure must exist. He needed to bring the horror into the light, but the Arsenaults were not careless. Jean-Baptiste was a formidable physical threat, and Delphine's intelligence was as sharp and dangerous as a razor. To go in alone would be suicide. He needed help, but more than that, he needed a plan that would expose the truth before he, too, ended up on the menu. Section 9. Moreau rode back to Pointe Coupée as if pursued by the devil himself. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Delphine Arsenault's welcoming smile, and he imagined her stirring a large pot over the fire. He knew he was running out of time. With every passing day, another unsuspecting traveler could be pulling up to the inn, seeking refuge and finding only a meticulously planned, horrifying end. He decided to confide in one man, Captain Gerard, the commander of the small Spanish garrison in the region. Gerard was a stern, pragmatic military man, not given to flights of fancy, but he respected Moreau, and more importantly, he had a deep-seated hatred for anything that threatened the order and authority of the Spanish crown. Moreau laid out his case, starting with the disappearances, the pattern, the discovery of the grave, and finally, his voice low and steady, he described what he had witnessed at the smokehouse. He watched the captain's face for any sign of disbelief, but Gerard listened intently, his expression hardening into a mask of grim resolve. When Moreau finished, the captain was silent for a long moment. He rose from his desk and walked to the window, looking out over the sleepy settlement. "Constable," he said, his back still to Moreau, "in my years fighting in the colonies, I have seen acts of barbarism that would curdle a man's blood. What you describe it is not beyond the realm of possibility. It is, however, an accusation that could destroy this entire parish with fear and rumor if it proves false." He turned, his eyes boring into Moreau. "But if it is true, then we are not dealing with common murderers. We are dealing with monsters. And monsters must be exterminated." The captain agreed to provide Moreau with a small contingent of soldiers, but on one condition: they would not make their move until they had irrefutable proof from inside the inn itself. The burden still rested on Moreau's shoulders. He would have to go back. He would have to walk into the lion's den, knowing exactly what the lions were. Section 10. The plan was perilous. Moreau would return to the inn not as a constable, but as a weary traveler. He would feign an injury, a lame horse, forcing him to stay the night. This would give him the opportunity to explore the premises after the Arsenaults were asleep. Captain Gerard's men would be hidden in the swamp, waiting for a signal. If the signal came, they would storm the inn. If it did not come by dawn, they would storm it anyway, assuming the worst. It was a desperate gamble. Moreau disguised himself, changing into the rough spun clothes of a trapper and dirtying his face with mud. He acquired a different horse and deliberately loosened one of its shoes a few miles from the inn. As he limped the horse toward the creaking sign of the famished crow, his heart hammered against his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back. He was walking willingly into a human slaughterhouse. Delphine greeted him with the same warm, disarming smile. She tutted with sympathy over his horse's apparent injury and assured him that Jean-Baptiste could see to it in the morning. "You look exhausted, monsieur," she said, her voice like honey. "Come inside, we have a hot stew on the fire that will restore your strength." The word sent a chill down Moreau's spine. He entered the common room, the familiar smell of wood smoke and roasting meat now turning his stomach. He forced a smile, accepted a bowl of the stew and pushed the dark, stringy meat around with his spoon, praying he would not have to eat it. He saw Jean-Baptiste watching him from the shadows of the bar, his eyes as cold and dead as a snake. They did not recognize him, for now the trap was set. He was the bait, and he could only pray the hunters did not realize their prey was a hunter himself. This single night would either expose a horrifying, forbidden truth or be his last. If you are finding this descent into the macabre as gripping as we are, consider subscribing to our channel. The darkest chapters of history are often the ones that have been deliberately forgotten, and what Moreau discovers next is a scene that was banned from the official records for its sheer, stomach-turning horror. Section 11. Moreau was given a small, Spartan room on the second floor. The window was boarded shut from the outside, and the simple wooden door had no lock from the inside, only a heavy latch on the exterior. It was a cell, not a guest room. He sat on the edge of the lumpy, straw-filled mattress, his senses on high alert. The sounds of the inn were amplified in the darkness, the groan of the floorboards, the hiss of the fire downstairs, the low murmur of the arsenaux' voices from their own quarters. He waited for hours, his nerves stretched to the breaking point. The silence he was waiting for, the deep, settled silence of a house asleep, was agonizingly slow to arrive. Finally, around 2 in the morning, the last whispers faded. The only sound was the chirping of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. It was time. Slipping off his boots, he crept to the door. He had brought a small, thin piece of metal, and with painstaking slowness he worked it through the crack in the doorframe, fumbling in the dark to find the latch on the other side. His fingers were slick with sweat. Any sound, any scrape of metal on wood could bring Jean-Baptiste to his door. After what felt like an eternity, he heard a faint click. The latch was lifted. He eased the door open and slipped into the darkened hallway, a ghost in the house of death. The air was thick and still. His first target was the smokehouse. He had to confirm his horrifying suspicion. He made his way down the stairs, each creak of the wood a thunderclap in the silence. He slipped out the back door and crept across the muddy yard, the silent silhouettes of the crows watching him from the trees. The smokehouse door was secured with a heavy iron padlock. It was a testament to the secrets it held. There was no way to open it quietly. The proof he needed was inside, but it was beyond his reach for now. He had to find another way. He had to find the source. His eyes turned to the heavy cellar doors, flush with the ground near the kitchen entrance. A faint, foul smell seemed to emanate from the cracks. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the true heart of this macabre operation was not in the smokehouse, but down there in the cold, dark earth beneath the inn. Section 12. The cellar doors were bolted from the outside with a thick wooden beam. It was heavy but manageable. Moreau lifted it slowly, his muscles straining, and set it down on the damp ground without a sound. He pulled one of the heavy doors open, revealing a set of steep stone steps descending into absolute blackness. A wave of putrid air washed over him, the smell of stale earth, rot, and something else, something metallic and sickly sweet, the unmistakable stench of old blood. He pulled a small candle stump and a flint from his pocket, his hands shaking so badly it took him 3 tries to strike a spark. The small flame flickered to life, pushing back the oppressive darkness just enough to illuminate the steps before him. Taking a deep breath to steady his nerves, he began his descent. The stone steps were cold and slick with moisture. The walls were lined with cobwebs that brushed against his face like the touch of dead fingers. With each step down, the smell grew stronger, more overpowering. It was a smell from a butcher's shop, but magnified, corrupted. He reached the bottom and held the candle aloft. The cellar was larger than he expected, with a low, beamed ceiling. The floor was packed earth. In one corner were barrels of wine and ale, as one would expect. But the rest of the space was a scene from a nightmare. Hanging from large iron hooks screwed into the ceiling beams were things, human limbs, torsos, drained of blood and in various stages of being butchered, like sides of beef in a slaughterhouse. On a massive, blood-soaked wooden table in the center of the room lay a collection of gruesome tools, cleavers, saws, and long, thin knives, all meticulously cleaned and arranged. This was not a place of frantic, passionate violence. This was a workshop, an abattoir for human beings, organized with horrifying efficiency and a practiced, methodical coldness that was far more terrifying than any frenzied rage. He had found the source. He had uncovered a secret so profoundly evil, so disturbing, it defied comprehension. Section 13. Moreau fought the urge to vomit. The candlelight danced across the macabre scene, creating grotesque, shifting shadows that seemed to writhe on the walls. He forced himself to move deeper into the cellar, needing to see the full extent of the horror to gather the proof Captain Gerard would need. Against the far wall, he found a collection of chests and trunks, the stolen belongings of the vanished travelers. He opened one and saw the fine silks of the Biloxi merchant. He opened another and found the surveying equipment belonging to Thomas Finch. Stacked neatly on a shelf were smaller, more personal items: wallets, jewelry, prayer beads, and a small leather-bound book of poetry. It was a museum of stolen lives, each item a silent scream from a victim who had met their end in this horrifying place. In another corner he found what looked like a tanning station with vats of brine and lye. Stretched on frames were pieces of what he first took to be animal hide. But a closer look revealed the faint, telltale patterns and textures of human skin. A cold, clinical part of his mind realized the arsenos were wasting nothing. Every part of their victims was being used, either for consumption, for profit, or for some other unimaginable purpose. He felt a profound sense of defilement, as if the very air he was breathing was corrupting his soul. This was not just murder. It was the complete and utter deconstruction of human beings, reducing them to mere resources, to meat and bone and skin. As he stood there, paralyzed by the sheer, calculated evil of it all, he heard a sound from above. A floorboard creaked in the kitchen. Then another. They were awake. Someone was coming. A sudden paralyzing fear gripped him. He was trapped in a subterranean tomb, surrounded by the dead, with the monsters stirring just above his head. He blew out the candle, plunging the cellar into absolute, terrifying darkness. Section 14. Crouched in the pitch-black cellar, Morrow's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Every sense was screaming. The suffocating stench of death was all around him. He could hear his own ragged breaths, loud as a bellows in the sudden silence. Above, the footsteps were slow, deliberate. He heard the scraping sound of a chair, then the unmistakable thud of a heavy boot. It was Jean-Baptiste. Morrow pressed himself back against the cold, damp stone wall, trying to melt into the shadows. He fumbled for the pistol tucked into his belt, the cold metal a small, inadequate comfort. What was Jean-Baptiste doing? Was it a random, middle-of-the-night stirring, or had he heard something? Had Morrow's careful movements not been careful enough? The footsteps moved across the kitchen floor directly towards the cellar entrance. Morrow's blood ran cold. He pictured the hulking figure of the innkeeper standing over the open doors, peering down into the darkness. He held his breath, praying the man would see nothing, would assume all was as it should be, and return to his bed. The silence stretched for an agonizingly long time. Morrow could feel sweat trickling down his temples. He imagined Jean-Baptiste's cold eyes scanning the darkness, his senses, honed by years of predatory living, picking up on the subtle change in the atmosphere, the scent of a living man amidst the dead. Then he heard the sound he had been dreading, the heavy groan of the cellar door being pulled shut, followed by the solid, definitive thump of the wooden beam being dropped back into place. He was sealed in. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. This was not a random check. They knew he was down here. He hadn't been discovered by accident. He had been lured, trapped, and entombed. The room he had been given, the unlocked door, the entire scenario, it had all been a performance. They had recognized him from the very beginning, and this cellar was to be his grave. Section 15. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm him. He was in a lightless, airless tomb, a larder of human flesh, and his captors were upstairs. He was no longer a constable conducting an investigation. He was just the next victim, another piece of meat for the hooks. He fought to control his breathing, to push down the rising tide of terror. Captain Gerard and his men were his only hope, but they weren't due to arrive until dawn. That was hours away. The arsenos would not wait that long. He had to find a way out. He relit his candle, the small flame a defiant pinprick against the crushing darkness. He surveyed his prison. The stone walls were solid, impenetrable. The heavy wooden doors above were his only exit, and they were barred. He was truly trapped. He began to search the cellar again, this time with frantic desperation. Was there another exit, a forgotten tunnel, a weak spot in the foundation? His search yielded nothing but more horror. Behind a stack of empty barrels, he found a pile of bones, skulls, ribs, femurs gnawed and cracked, presumably for their marrow. This was the final stage of their grotesque process, the last remnants of the people who had vanished from the world. Among the bones, he saw something small and metallic. He picked it up. It was a cross, simple and unadorned, the kind a priest might carry. Father O'Connell. The discovery filled him with a renewed, cold rage that burned away his fear. He would not end up in that pile. He would not let these monsters win. His eyes scanned the cellar one last time, and then he saw it. It was not an exit, but it was a chance. In the corner near the tanning vats was a small grated opening in the stone wall near the ceiling. It was no bigger than his head, likely for ventilation. It was too small to crawl through, but it led to the outside. It led to the world of the living. It was a way to deliver his signal. He had to get Captain Gerard's attention, and he had to do it now. Section 16. Morrow looked around the gruesome cellar for something to stand on. He dragged a heavy, empty crate over to the wall beneath the ventilation grate. It was still too high. He stacked a smaller barrel on top, creating a precarious, wobbly platform. He climbed onto it, the wood groaning under his weight. He could just reach the grate. It was covered in rust and thick cobwebs, but through the small openings, he could see the faint, gray light of the pre-dawn sky. He could smell the clean, damp air of the swamp, a stark contrast to the foulness of his prison. He still had his pistol, a single-shot flintlock. It was his only way to make a sound loud enough to carry through the dense woods to where Gerard and his men were waiting, but it was an incredible risk. The moment he fired it, the arsenos would know his exact position and his intentions. They would surely come for him. It would be a race. Could Gerard's men get to him before the arsenos did? He had no other choice. He checked the pistol's priming, took a deep breath, and jammed the barrel through the bars of the grate, pointing it towards the sky. He closed his eyes and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space. The recoil nearly threw him from his perch. Plaster and dust rained down from the ceiling. For a moment, the world was nothing but the ringing in his ears and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Above him, he heard immediate, frantic sounds. A woman's shriek, Delphine, followed by the heavy, running footsteps of Jean-Baptiste. They were coming. He had sounded the alarm, but he had also summoned his executioners. He dropped from the crate, landing hard on the packed earth floor, and drew his hunting knife. He would not die on one of their hooks. He would make his last stand here, surrounded by the ghosts of their victims in the dark heart of their macabre empire. Section 17. The sound of the gunshot ripped through the pre-dawn stillness of the swamp. A mile away, hidden in a thicket of cypress trees, Captain Gerard and his 6 soldiers heard it clear as day. It was the signal. "Move," Gerard commanded, his voice a harsh whisper. The soldiers, already on edge, needed no further encouragement. They broke from their cover, muskets at the ready, and began to advance on the inn. They moved with practiced efficiency, fanning out as they crossed the clearing, their boots sinking into the soft, wet ground. The inn stood before them, a dark, silent silhouette against the lightening sky. A single lamp had just been lit in a downstairs window, a jaundiced eye opening in the darkness. They knew they were racing against time. A single gunshot could mean anything, but in this context, it meant their man was in desperate, mortal danger. As they drew closer, the eerie silence was broken by a new sound, a sound from within the inn. It was a horrifying, guttural scream of rage, followed by the splintering crash of wood. The monsters inside were awake, and they were furious. Gerard's men fixed their bayonets, the scrape of steel on steel cutting through the air. The faint light of dawn was just beginning to touch the tops of the cypress trees, but down here in the shadow of the Inn of the Famished Crow, the night was about to get much, much darker. The secrets of this forbidden place had been exposed, and now it would demand a final, bloody price from anyone who dared to enter. The history of this place is written in blood, and if you have the stomach to see it through to its horrifying conclusion, make sure you are subscribed. We bring you the stories that have been deliberately buried, because the truth is often more terrifying than any legend. Section 18. Down in the cellar, Morrow scrambled for cover, his knife held tight in his hand. The sounds from above were terrifying. He could hear Jean-Baptiste roaring like a wounded bull, followed by the crash of something heavy being overturned. Then came the sound of the heavy wooden beam being lifted from the cellar doors. A sliver of lamplight cut through the darkness as one of the doors was thrown open. Delphine Arsenault's face appeared in the opening, her features twisted into a mask of pure venom. Her welcoming smile was gone, replaced by a snarl that revealed her true, predatory nature. "You filthy pig," she hissed, her voice dripping with hatred. "You have ruined everything." Behind her, Jean-Baptiste appeared, his massive frame filling the doorway. In his hands he held a woodsman's axe, its blade gleaming in the lamplight. He didn't speak. He simply stared down at Morrow with an expression of cold, murderous intent. There was no escape. Morrow flattened himself against the far wall, near the gruesome pile of bones, determined to sell his life dearly. Jean-Baptiste started down the stone steps, his movements surprisingly agile for a man of his size. The cellar, which had felt so large and menacing just moments before, now felt like a tiny, claustrophobic box. This was the end of the line. This was the same fate that had met the surveyor, the priest, and countless others. The only difference was that Morrow knew it was coming. He braced himself for the charge, his knuckles white on the hilt of his knife. The final, brutal confrontation in this subterranean hell was about to begin. But just as Jean-Baptiste reached the bottom step and raised his axe, another sound cut through the tension. The sharp, authoritative crack of a musket shot from outside, followed by the shattering of a window in the common room above. Captain Gerard had arrived. Section 19. The sound of the musket shot momentarily stunned the Arsenaults. Jean-Baptiste froze on the bottom step, his head snapping up towards the sounds of shouting and breaking glass from above. Delphine let out a curse, her face a mixture of fury and alarm. That split second of distraction was all Morrow needed. He surged forward, not at the hulking form of Jean-Baptiste, but towards the stone steps. He had to get out of the cellar to join the fight, to bear witness. He charged past the giant, shoving him hard against the wall. Jean-Baptiste stumbled, caught off guard, his axe swinging wildly and biting deep into a wooden support beam. Morrow scrambled up the steps, emerging into the chaotic scene in the kitchen. 2 of Gerard's soldiers were already inside, their muskets leveled. Delphine, seeing her escape cut off, let out a feral scream. She grabbed a large butcher's knife from a block on the counter and lunged at the nearest soldier. She moved with a shocking, desperate speed, but the soldier was ready. He parried her strike with his musket barrel and brought the butt of the weapon around in a hard, swift arc, catching her on the side of the head. She crumpled to the floor unconscious. At the same moment, Jean-Baptiste came roaring up from the cellar, his axe now free. He was a terrifying sight, his face contorted in a mask of pure rage, his eyes locked on Morrow. He charged, swinging the axe in a deadly horizontal arc meant to cleave Morrow in two. Morrow threw himself backwards, tumbling over a table as the axe blade whistled through the air where his head had been, embedding itself deep in the wall behind him. The force of the blow was so great that the axe handle shuddered, and for a critical second Jean-Baptiste was off balance, struggling to free his weapon. It was the opening Gerard needed. The captain stepped through the doorway, his own pistol drawn. "It's over, Arsenault," he said, his voice cold and steady. Jean-Baptiste ignored him, his only focus on pulling the axe from the wall for another attack. The captain's pistol roared and Jean-Baptiste's massive body went rigid. He stood for a moment, a look of shocked surprise on his face before collapsing to the floor like a felled oak tree. Silence descended upon the inn, broken only by the ragged breathing of the survivors and the drip of blood onto the floorboards. Section 20. The immediate aftermath was a scene of controlled chaos. As dawn broke, casting a sickly gray light through the shattered windows of the inn, Captain Gerard's men secured the property. Delphine Arsenault was bound and gagged, her unconscious form showing no remorse, only a deep simmering hatred. Jean-Baptiste's body lay where it had fallen, a grim monument to the violence of the morning. Moreau, exhausted and covered in filth from the cellar, led a stunned and horrified Captain Gerard down the stone steps. Nothing could have prepared the seasoned military commander for what he saw. He stared at the human remains hanging from hooks, at the blood-soaked table, at the vats of tanning solution, his face paling. He ran a hand over his mouth, turning away, his composure finally breaking. "Saints preserve us," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "What is this place?" The soldiers, one by one, were brought down to bear witness. Their tough military exteriors crumbled in the face of such systematic, cold-blooded butchery. One young soldier retched violently in a corner. Another simply stood, his eyes wide with a silent, profound horror. This was not a crime scene, it was a desecration. It was the absolute negation of all that was human. They began the grim task of searching the rest of the inn. In the Arsenault's quarters, they found more evidence. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard was a leather satchel filled with coins, jewelry, and gold teeth, the grim profits of their enterprise. They also found a ledger, but it wasn't for guests. It was a different kind of accounting, written in Delphine's neat, elegant script. It listed names, dates, and alongside each name a series of disturbing notes. Fine quality, little fat, sinewy, best for stew, skin unblemished. It was a recipe book from hell, a horrifying document that catalogued their victims not as people, but as produce. The full, disturbing, and macabre scope of their operation was finally laid bare. Section 21. The discovery that was perhaps the most psychologically disturbing came not from the cellar, but from the inn's kitchen pantry. At first glance, it appeared normal. There were sacks of flour, barrels of salted fish, and shelves lined with jars of preserved vegetables. But behind them on the back shelves were other jars. The soldiers initially passed them over, but Moreau, his mind now attuned to the Arsenault's particular brand of evil, took a closer look. The jars contained what looked like preserved meats, pickles, and rendered fats. But the labels, again in Delphine's script, told a different story. Pickled tongue T. Finch, potted meat M. O'Connell, lard Natchez couple. They had been preserving their victims, creating trophies, and in a final act of unimaginable depravity, incorporating them into the very fabric of their larder. The food served at the Inn of the Famished Crow was not just a means of disposing of evidence. It was a celebration of their crimes. Every meal served was a sacrament to their own monstrosity. Unsuspecting travelers had sat by the fire, complimenting their hosts on the richness of the stew, while unknowingly consuming the very people the Arsenaults had murdered. This revelation was a new level of horror. It went beyond cannibalism as a means of survival or a ritualistic act. This was culinary sadism. It was a quiet, intimate, and continuous act of violation against their victims and their guests alike. The soldiers began removing the jars from the pantry, their hands shaking, their faces grim. Each jar was a tombstone. Each label was an epitaph written by the killer. The sheer audacity of it, the black-hearted evil of hiding their crimes in plain sight on the plates and in the bellies of their patrons, was a truth so horrifying it felt like it could poison the world itself. The inn was not just a place of murder, it was a temple of defilement. Section 22. As the sun rose higher, casting light into the dark corners of the inn, the soldiers made their final grim search of the grounds. They followed the path Moreau had seen Jean-Baptiste take to the smokehouse. After breaking the heavy padlock, they swung the door open. The interior was dark and the smell was overwhelming. Hanging from the rafters, alongside strings of sausages and slabs of what was clearly not pork, were more human remains, blackened and cured by the smoke. It was here they found the partial remains of the priest, Father O'Connell, identifiable only by a small piece of his clerical collar that had been caught on a hook. The sausages, when cut open, revealed a gruesome, unidentifiable mixture of ground meat, herbs, and small hard fragments that could have been bone. This was where the burlap sack had been taken. This was where the parts of the victims deemed less desirable for pies or stews were processed into something that could be stored, sold, or served later. The scale of the operation was breathtakingly evil. It was clear the Arsenaults had been doing this for years, perfecting their horrifying craft. They had created a self-sustaining ecosystem of murder. They lured travelers, killed them for their valuables, and then used their bodies as the very resource that would attract the next victims. The famous, hearty food of the inn was its most effective lure and its most terrible secret. The soldiers worked in grim silence, carrying the remains out into the daylight and laying them on canvas tarps. The convocation of crows in the cypress trees remained, their black eyes watching the proceedings, their long silence finally chillingly making sense. They were not just birds, they were a silent funeral procession, the only witnesses to the years of unspoken, forbidden atrocities committed at their feet. Section 23. The question of justice for the Arsenaults was swift and severe. Delphine, having regained consciousness, was transformed. The charming innkeeper was gone, replaced by a snarling, venomous creature filled with pure, unadulterated hate. She spat at the soldiers, her eyes burning with a terrifying fire. She showed no remorse, no fear, only rage at having been caught. Her confession, if it could be called that, was a boast. She spoke of their victims with contempt, calling them weak, stupid sheep who deserved their fate. She recounted with chilling detail the specifics of their culinary creations, mocking the travelers who had praised her cooking. Her words were so vile, so devoid of humanity, that Captain Gerard was forced to have her gagged again. The Spanish authorities in New Orleans were notified, but both Girard and Morrow knew that a public trial was out of the question. The story was too monstrous, too inflammatory. It would cause mass panic. It would deter travel and commerce. It would stain the reputation of the Louisiana territory in a way that no simple tale of banditry ever could. A decision was made in quiet, official circles. The story had to be contained. It had to be buried. This was a forbidden history, one that society could not be allowed to digest. Under the authority of the colonial governor, a secret military tribunal was convened on the grounds of the inn itself. The evidence was presented: the bodies, the ledger, the jars from the pantry. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. The sentence was death. There would be no fanfare, no public spectacle. The evil of the Arsenaults would be erased as quietly and efficiently as they had erased their own victims. Justice would be done, but the truth would be sacrificed for the sake of order. Section 24. 2 days after their capture, Jean-Baptiste and Delphine Arsenault were executed. There was no gallows. There was no firing squad. Captain Girard, tasked with carrying out the sentence, decided on a form of justice he felt was more fitting. The Arsenaults had lived by fire, the fire of their hearth, the fire of their smokehouse. So they would die by fire. The soldiers cleared out the inn's common room, piling the furniture in the center. The bodies of the victims, those that could be recovered, were given a proper burial in consecrated ground a safe distance away. Then the inn itself would become a pyre. Jean-Baptiste, already dead, was dragged inside. Delphine, still alive, bound and gagged, was placed in the center of the room. She watched them with wide, terrified eyes, the first true fear she had shown since her capture. She understood what was about to happen. Morrow stood outside, watching as the soldiers brought torches. He felt no satisfaction, no triumph, only a profound, soul-deep weariness. He had hunted the monsters and won, but he knew the memory of this place, the things he had seen in that cellar, would haunt him for the rest of his life. Captain Girard gave the order. The torches were thrown through the windows. The dry timber of the old building, soaked with years of grease and grime, caught instantly. Flames erupted with a hungry roar, consuming the dark heart of the inn. The fire spread with incredible speed, turning the building into a raging inferno. For a moment, those outside thought they heard a single, muffled scream from within, quickly swallowed by the roar of the blaze. The Inn of the Famished Crow, the House of Horrors, was being purged from the face of the earth, its terrible secrets turning to smoke and ash, rising into the Louisiana sky. Section 25. The fire burned for a full day and night, a furious, cleansing blaze that reduced the inn to a blackened, smoking crater. When it was over, all that remained was the stone foundation and the great central chimney, standing like a tombstone against the sky. The soldiers raked through the ashes, ensuring everything was destroyed. The cellar had collapsed, burying its horrors under tons of charred timber and hot stone. The official report, written by Captain Girard and co-signed by Constable Morrow, was a masterpiece of deliberate omission. It stated that the innkeepers, the Arsenaults, were discovered to be the leaders of a gang of bandits responsible for the recent string of disappearances. It claimed they were killed while resisting arrest and that their ill-gotten gains were recovered. The inn, it was noted, tragically caught fire during the confrontation. There was no mention of cannibalism. No mention of the smokehouse, the pantry, or the macabre ledger. The horrifying central truth of the case was intentionally and systematically erased from the historical record. It was deemed too disturbing for public knowledge. The families of the victims were quietly notified that the murderers of their loved ones had been brought to justice, but they were never told the full, grisly details of their fates. The story was banned not by official decree, but by a conspiracy of silence among the handful of men who knew the truth. They had looked into an abyss of human depravity so profound that they collectively decided it was better to pretend it didn't exist. They had sealed the forbidden story away, hoping it would be forgotten forever. But some stories, especially the most macabre, have a way of refusing to stay buried. Section 26. In the years that followed, the legend of the Inn of the Famished Crow began to grow, twisting and changing as it was passed down in whispers around campfires and in the dark corners of taverns. Without the horrifying facts to anchor it, the story drifted into the realm of the supernatural. The Arsenaults became demonic figures, practitioners of dark magic who made pacts with evil spirits in the swamp. The inn became a haunted place, a gateway to hell. People claimed that on dark, moonless nights you could still see a faint, flickering light where the inn once stood, and hear the faint screams of its countless victims on the wind. The trace road that passed the site fell into disuse. Travelers, guided by fear and local warnings, began taking a longer, safer route to the north. The wilderness slowly, inexorably reclaimed the land. The blackened foundation was swallowed by vines and saw palmetto. The great stone chimney, a stubborn monument to evil, was eventually pulled down by the roots of a massive oak tree. Within a generation, it was as if the inn had never existed at all. It survived only as a local ghost story, a cautionary tale told to frighten children. The horrifying reality of what Jean-Baptiste and Delphine Arsenault had done was lost, diluted into folklore. This is often the fate of history's most disturbing truths. When a reality is too monstrous to confront, we turn it into a myth. We transform the perpetrators into demons and their crimes into a curse because the alternative, accepting that ordinary people, our neighbors, are capable of such calculated, systematic evil, is a truth far too terrifying to live with. Section 27. Constable Mauro was never the same. He had been a man of law and order, a believer in the rational world, but what he had seen in that cellar fractured his understanding of reality. He resigned from his post a year after the incident, unable to continue his work. He became a recluse, building a small cabin for himself deep in the woods, far from any road. He was haunted by the faces of the victims he had never known but had, in a way, come to represent. He was haunted by the smell of the smokehouse and the sight of Delphine's elegant, deadly handwriting in her ledger. He had done his duty, he had stopped the evil, but he had paid a terrible price. His soul had been irrecoverably stained by the darkness he had uncovered. He rarely spoke to anyone, and when he did, his eyes had a distant, haunted look, as if he were perpetually seeing the ghosts of the past. The other soldiers who had been part of the raid were also deeply affected. Many of them became devoutly religious, seeking solace in the church. Others turned to drink, trying to drown the memories that surfaced in the dead of night. They had been sworn to secrecy, and they kept their oath, but the shared, unspoken trauma of what they had witnessed that day at the inn bound them together in a silent, grim fraternity. They were the keepers of a forbidden secret, a knowledge of the true depths of human depravity that set them apart from the rest of the world. They knew that evil was not some abstract concept or a supernatural force. It was real, it was tangible, and it could wear a welcoming smile while sharpening a butcher's knife. Section 28. What was the motivation behind the Arsenault's horrifying acts? The official suppressed report concluded it was simple greed. They were robbers who found a uniquely macabre way to dispose of the evidence. But Mauro, in his solitude, came to believe it was something far more disturbing. He didn't believe they started out as cannibals. He believed they started as simple murderers, killing a traveler for their money and burying the body in the swamp. But the swamp is a fickle place. Bodies have a way of resurfacing. So perhaps one day Jean-Baptiste, a practical man of the frontier, suggested a more permanent solution. The smokehouse, the fire pit, and then perhaps Delphine, with her cold, cruel intelligence, took it a step further. Why waste the meat? Why not use it to enrich their stews, to fatten their profits, to make their inn famous? Mauro imagined it as a slow, creeping descent into absolute monstrosity. A journey that began with a single act of violence, and through practicality and a complete lack of empathy, evolved into a systematic, industrial process of butchery. He believed that over time they came to enjoy it. The power, the control, the ultimate act of domination over their victims. Delphine's ledger was not just an accounting, it was a trophy case. Her culinary experiments were not just about disposal, they were acts of creative sadism. They were not driven by a curse or a demon. They were driven by the darkest, most forbidden impulses of the human psyche, allowed to fester and grow in the isolation of the Louisiana wilderness, far from the eyes of law or God. Section 29. One of the most chilling and unresolved questions of the case is just how many victims there were. The names in Delphine's ledger accounted for nearly 40 individuals over a period of 5 years. But the ledger only started 5 years prior. The Arsenaults had owned the inn for almost 15 years. Were there other ledgers destroyed in the fire? The physical evidence found in the cellar and the grave, the bones, the personal effects, corresponded to perhaps a dozen people. But this was only a fraction of what must have been the true number. How many bodies were completely disposed of in the fire pit? How many were sunk deep into the bayou, weighed down with stones? How many unsuspecting travelers were fed the remains of their predecessors, only to become the main course for the next guests? The true number is unknowable, but it could easily have been over 100. 100 lives erased from the world. 100 families who never knew what became of their loved ones, left to wonder for the rest of their days. The Inn of the Famished Crow was not just a house of horrors. It was a silent, voracious black hole on the edge of the American frontier, consuming souls one by one, leaving not even a memory behind. The scale of their crimes is what makes this case so deeply disturbing. It speaks to the terrifying vulnerability of the individual in a world without oversight, where a friendly smile and the promise of a hot meal could be the prelude to an unimaginable, macabre end. Section 30. The story of the Arsenaults and their inn is a prime example of a forbidden history, a truth so unsettling that the powers that be actively worked to suppress it. The Spanish authorities in 1795 had a vested interest in portraying Louisiana as a stable, governable territory, ripe for settlement and commerce. A widely publicized story about cannibalistic innkeepers murdering travelers on a main road would have been disastrous. It would have confirmed every fear that potential settlers had about the wild, untamed nature of the frontier. It would have been a stain on the colony's reputation that could have had real economic and political consequences. So they buried it. They chose stability over truth, creating a sanitized version of events that served their purposes. This impulse is not unique to 1795. Throughout history, we see examples of horrifying, inconvenient, or embarrassing truths being deliberately obscured, rewritten, or erased from the official narrative. We are often presented with a curated version of the past, one that is more palatable, more heroic, or simply less complicated. But the dark, macabre, and forbidden stories like this one are just as much a part of our history. They remind us that the past was not always a simpler time. They remind us of the darkness that humans are capable of, a darkness that is not confined to any one era or place. Uncovering these banned stories is not about sensationalism. It is about understanding the full, often terrifying, spectrum of human experience. Section 31. The legacy of this case lives on, not in official history books, but in the psychological imprint it left on the land itself. The concept of the killer inn is an archetypal horror trope, from Procrustes in Greek mythology to the modern-day slasher film. But the case of the Arsenault is a terrifying reminder that this trope has roots in a grim reality. For centuries, isolated inns and taverns on lonely roads were places of immense vulnerability for travelers. They were removed from the protection of towns and the oversight of the law. An unscrupulous innkeeper held a position of absolute power over their guests, who were often exhausted, alone, and carrying all their worldly possessions. How many other famished crows operated on the dark and dangerous roads of the old world? How many disappearances attributed to bandits or accidents were actually the work of predators hiding in plain sight, offering a warm bed before delivering a cold death? The true number is impossible to know. Most were likely never caught. Their crimes were absorbed by the wilderness, their secrets kept forever. The Arsenaults were an anomaly only in that they were exposed. Their story serves as a horrifying window into a secret history of predation that shadowed the expansion of civilization. It reminds us that for every beacon of light on the frontier, there was often a corresponding patch of profound and terrifying darkness, sometimes residing right there in the house that promised sanctuary. Section 32. This entire horrifying saga hinged on the instincts and determination of one man, Constable Louis Moreau. Without his refusal to accept the easy answers, without his suspicion and his willingness to risk his own life, the Arsenaults' reign of terror would have continued indefinitely. They would have gone on murdering, butchering, and serving their victims for years, their evil hidden beneath a veneer of rustic hospitality. Moreau is the unsung hero of this macabre tale, a man who stared into the abyss and did not flinch. Yet he is a ghost in the historical record, his name appearing only briefly on a falsified report. His personal sacrifice, the psychological toll this case took on him, is completely unrecorded. He saved countless lives but was himself a casualty of the horror he uncovered. This is often the fate of those who confront true evil. There is no clean victory. The darkness once seen cannot be unseen. It leaves a permanent mark on the soul. The story of the Inn of the Famished Crow is therefore not just a tale of two monsters, but also a testament to the quiet, thankless courage of the man who stopped them. It's a reminder that history is often shaped by the actions of ordinary individuals who find themselves in extraordinary, and in this case, horrifying circumstances, and who choose to act even at great personal cost. Section 33. The land where the inn once stood remains empty to this day. It is a small, unremarkable patch of wilderness just off a modern highway, a place that tens of thousands of people pass every year without a second glance. There is no plaque, no marker, no indication of the almost unbelievable horror that transpired there over 2 centuries ago. The swamp has completely erased the scar. The official records are sealed or lost. The story exists now only in the liminal space between folklore and forgotten history. It is a forbidden story because it confronts us with an unbearable truth, that the greatest monsters are not supernatural demons or mythical beasts, but human beings. They are the smiling innkeeper, the helpful neighbor, the person who offers you shelter from the storm. The case of Jean-Baptiste and Delphine Arsenault is a cold, hard reminder that evil is often mundane, practical, and terrifyingly close. These are the kinds of histories that get erased, the ones that challenge our sense of safety and order, and we are here to unearth them. If this journey into the dark has held you captive, consider supporting our channel by subscribing. We are dedicated to bringing these forgotten and often banned stories out of the shadows and into the light, no matter how disturbing the truth may be. Section 34. In the end, what makes the case of the tavern that served more than wine so profoundly chilling is its completeness. The Arsenaults created a perfect, closed loop of horror. It was a business model built on murder. The victims provided the capital, their stolen goods, and the product, their bodies, which in turn attracted more victims. It was a macabre engine that fueled itself, a terrifying microcosm of predation hidden in the Louisiana swamp. Their crime was not a momentary lapse of sanity or a single act of passion. It was a chosen way of life. It was a career. This level of sustained, organized depravity is what separates the Arsenaults from common killers and places them in a unique, dark pantheon of human monsters. They didn't just kill people, they commodified them, deconstructed them, and integrated them into the very walls and meals of their home. They erased the line between person and product, between hospitality and horror, so completely that the two became indistinguishable. The inn was not a house where murders happened. The inn was the murder, a living, breathing entity of death and consumption, with Jean-Baptiste and Delphine as its black, beating heart. Section 35. Does the evil of a place linger after the perpetrators are gone? The locals who still tell the ghost stories about the site of the inn would say yes. They would say the ground is soured, that the souls of the victims are trapped there, that the malevolent energy of the Arsenaults' acts seeped into the very soil. A rational mind would dismiss this as superstition, but one cannot help but wonder. The sheer weight of the suffering and terror that was concentrated on that one small piece of land is difficult to comprehend. Perhaps some echo of it remains, a cold spot in the air, an unnatural silence among the trees. The story ends, but the feeling of dread it instills does not. It leaves us with a lingering, uncomfortable question. As we travel down our own lonely roads, as we put our trust in the kindness of strangers, as we sit down to eat in a place we've never been before, we are haunted by the shadow of the famished crow. We are left to wonder about the dark, hidden histories of the seemingly ordinary places we pass through every day, and the forbidden, horrifying secrets that might be buried just beneath our feet, waiting to be discovered.